This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of guys with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 273, Preparing for Multilanguage. Welcome to Talking Drupal. As you're looking forward to your upcoming projects in 2021, will they support multiple languages? Today, we're going to discuss the things to keep in mind as you are planning a translatable project. Welcome back, everybody.
Hey, Nick.
Howdy.
Joining us as usual, Stephen Cross with Parallax Info Technology. What's new with you this week?
Hey, not much. I got a new toy this week. I always have new toys. And I've got two listed in the show notes, but I'm just going to go with one for today. Have you guys heard of the Pi, Raspberry Pi 400?
I've heard of a Raspberry Pi.
It's a brand new product from them. It is pretty crazy. So let me show it to you. This is for the video people. I'll describe it as I show it. It's a keyboard, but it's got the Pi 4 built into it.
Yeah.
So it's like a computer all in one.
I saw that on one of the various social networks.
So super, super interesting. It's basically a Pi 4 that's been overclocked a little bit. So it's a little tiny bit faster than the Pi 4. But it's got all the ports right on the keyboard, and it's actually a pretty nice keyboard. It's not like a piece of junk. I thought it would feel like a toy, but it doesn't. It feels like a Mac keyboard. You know what I mean? It's got that. It's pretty solid. It's got that kind of low profile, and basically you just plug in. When it comes, you can get the keyboard by itself for $70, or you could spend $100 and then get the HDMI, get the Raspberry, get the micro SD card. Did I say HDMI port, a cable, get a power cord, and a mouse. So basically all you need then is just something to plug it into, either a TV or a screen. And you just turn it on. It comes with a SD card already. You just turn it on and you're up and running.
I wonder if you can, it'd be cool if you could use it as a keyboard for a normal computer. And if you just want to have like a little mini computer to like run experiments on and just like switch back and forth, that'd be something else.
And look at it also has a Ethernet port in it too, which is pretty cool. But it's got Bluetooth and it's got wireless, and so it's got everything. So what's it useful for? Well, it's interesting use case, and why I kind of bought it just to see is because I have like 4 or 5 Pis, maybe 6 Pis now. I don't use any of them in a GUI, right? They're all just kind of servers doing like server-y kind of things for me. This is clearly now a desktop computer, right? That's what the intent is. It's got a keyboard on it. It's got all those peripherals. So could it actually be used as a computer? I think for a developer, probably not, but really for an everyday user who's just trying to like browse the web, go to Facebook, do things like that, it really runs really well. It's surprisingly how good it runs. I've been running it for a few days. It's on my desk, been doing all my mail, my browsing, chatting, that kind of stuff on it. And it really works well.
What operating system does it have
so
on it?
It comes with Raspbian, which is like their Linux flavor. But I quickly fired up Ubuntu and put another card in Ubuntu in it. And that's what I'm running on it right now. So it looks just like Ubuntu that you would get on a desktop. It really runs surprisingly well. And my next experiment will be to
Does Zoom work.
So Zoom, I tested Zoom last night a little bit. There's no client. There's no ARM client for Zoom. So it's browser based. So it works, but it's not super great for that, I don't think. I haven't experimented with it too much. I was having trouble getting the sound to work through my I had a headset on it that has a mic and speakers. The mic worked fine. I hooked a camera up to it. The camera worked fine, but I couldn't hear any audio. So I didn't muck around with it too much. But I just tested it. My next experiment is I've got a SD USB 3 SD. And I've already loaded Ubuntu onto this, and I'm going to boot from this because the speed of this is like 10 times faster than the micro SD card.
SD card.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see how it performs. There's a little bit of lag when you're using it for everyday use, but I could easily see someone putting this for kids, for your parents, like maybe older people who just need their Facebook and their browser and that kind of stuff. It would work perfect. And there's little they can mess up with it, right? So if you got someone who you kind of help, who needs access online, and you're always kind of supporting them, they're downloading stuff they shouldn't, just keep an SD card ready. So when they've screwed something up, you just go switch out the SD cards, they're back up and running, right? It's really
older people are going to start calling keyboards computers now instead of monitors.
Makes me almost think like it would be a really good testing machine. Like if you were doing a lot of browser testing or some sort of product testing, like you could have different SD cards with different operating systems on them and just drop in whichever one you needed to test on.
I mean, at the price of them, you would just probably have more than one Raspberry Pi. But
that seems
it's so simple.
It seems wasteful, but okay. I mean, like,
you have to reboot them. So yeah, I mean, that's fascinating. I'm definitely gonna have to look into it. It seems interesting, that's for sure. Anyway, also joining us as usual this week is John Picozu with Oomfink. What's new with you?
Sorry, I'm still thinking about Steven's discussion topic there.
I did
so many different ideas.
By the way, I did load Docker on it too, and it ran.
Oh wow!
I just had to play with it. Just see, I didn't go as far as firing up trying to run Lando and Drupal, but I probably could because Docker installed like nothing, and
Steven,
it ran.
I feel like that could be like your game console for you, like PC game
it's
console.
Definitely not a gaming console. Doesn't have enough juice.
Not enough juice. All right.
Yeah. It's got 4 gigs of memory, which is good. And they're talking about putting on an 8 gig version, but the CPU is not powerful enough for gaming. Simple games, but not complex games.
It's more powerful than my first computer, but so it can't handle anything new.
One more thing, sorry. Jeff Geerling has a number of videos out on this product, which is where I think I first heard about when it was released. They sent him a like initial version of it. He's done a bunch of he's done a teardown video, like an intro video, and done some performance testing. So if you're interested in seeing more, check out Jeff Geerling's site.
It doesn't entirely surprise me. I kind of figured. I think actually that's where I saw it before you just showed it. Was on Jeff's social. So I talked about I think last week I talked about ordering a tree from the sill. Well, or maybe that was 2 weeks ago. Anyway, tree has arrived. Tree is lovely, and I don't know, something about it just makes me happy. I also bought some shelves, which again seems like such a dumb, like ridiculously easy thing, but like this set of 3 shelves from Amazon was like, I don't even know, like $26 maybe, something like that. And they're like nice wood shelves with metal brackets to mount them, and like mounting them was super easy. I don't know. They're great. Tree shelf. I actually put my lamp up there. It's lovely.
So just to give people who are listening a picture of this, and you can't actually see it, as John is sitting in his desk, he's facing a corner, and he put the shelves up in the corner, and on the shelf is a lamp and a tree. So that's what you're kind of looking at as you're sitting there, right, John?
Yes. Yep. If I look above my camera, I'm like, oh, look, it's a tree. And my light was behind my monitor, but I've gotten it up higher now. So it provides a little bit more light to my desk area.
Right.
And then the other thing was microwave, which is weird. It's a weird topic to talk about, but years ago we redid our kitchen, and part of that was going out and buying like a above the range microwave. And a couple of weeks ago, like half of the buttons on it stopped working. Not like this half, like the right half or the left half, but like just randomly half the buttons stopped working. So I called my appliance place, and they were like, oh, well, it's going to be like, $600 for a new microwave. And I was like, what? And they're like, try calling General Electric, GE. They make the microwave. So after kind of going through the phone tree a couple times at GE, I talked to somebody, and he was great. I think his name was Jonathan. And he was like, yeah, we can get you a new microwave for like $330. We'll install it, and we'll take the old one away. And I was like, literally before this conversation, I was like ready to write off General Electric and like their support and service. And this guy totally turned it around for me.
How old is it, John?
3 years old. The microwave was 3 years old, which I'm like, why? Like 3 years? Like this thing should be lasting longer than 3 years. Yeah. Oddly enough, the new microwave looks like it has a newer key panel on it. So it must have been a issue they ran into quite a bit. And according to the dates on this one looks like it just came out in September. So this is relatively new, but anyway, I thought it was interesting that, GE was willing to work and help me out like that. So
there's nothing better than great customer service and appreciation from a company.
Well, it's interesting because literally before talking to that guy, I was like, this is ridiculous. I've had to call these people 4 times before I could like talk to somebody. The 2 people I talked to prior, like the connection wasn't good, and English did not appear to be their first language. So it was kind of hard to understand them. They were also talking very fast and mumbling. But then, I got this guy, and he was like, oh yeah, let me take a look. Oh, we can do this. Oh, we can do that. And then they were like, oh, we'll install it and take the old one away. And I was like, okay, so you like single-handedly took a problem that I had. My microwave doesn't work, and like fixed the whole thing to the point of where we're at today, where I have like a brand new microwave and it works perfectly fine.
For a fairly substantial fee, though. Let's be clear.
Not actually though, because so it was $330, which, okay, you could go buy a cheaper microwave for less than that. But new microwave was like $5 and change, closer to $600. To fix the microwave I had was going to be $400 for the part, and then $150 to have it fixed. So like, I was all set to have it fixed. I was like, all right, we'll just have it fixed. Right. And the repair guy was like, I would probably not have this fixed and just go get a new one.
Yeah.
So it's just amazing to me that like, and then you talk to my mom, and she's like, well, I've had the same microwave for the last 15 years. And I'm like, yeah, I know. But anyway,
so I have 2 follow-ons to that. One is I recently realized that my microwave, I don't know how it took me so long to realize this, but my microwave interferes with Bluetooth. So I have a wireless Bluetooth headset, and if I go let the dog out, I basically have to go down the hall through the kitchen to the mudroom. And so if I'm on a call with somebody,
like when it's on, right? The microwave.
Yeah, no. So if the microwave's off, I can let Kitako out and still hear the meeting that I'm in. So if I'm in a meeting, I'm just listening in, I'm not participating, Kitako needs to go outside or come in, I can go let him in, let him out. But if I'm like listening to some music or something and I put the microwave on, have my headset on, it cuts out when I get about halfway through like when the microwave is between me and the receiver, it doesn't work anymore. Like the microwave is being used. Yeah. Only when it's used. When it's not used, everything works fine. But it took me like, no. I mean, it's obvious to some people, but it took me like 2 years to realize that's why sometimes the headset cuts out. Other times it doesn't.
So Nick, what's going on with you?
I'm actually going to change what my weekly update was going to be based on yours. So I recently had a similar situation for customer service. So a couple of weeks ago, we talked about home automation. One of the companies I get a lot of equipment from is a company called Aon Labs. They have a brand called AO Tech, and they have generally very high quality devices. Every device, like I have some basically soft touch buttons, so like you can touch them, double tap them, swipe. Very, very high quality. The only 2 things I've ever gotten from them that were slightly questionable, and a huge emphasis on slightly. One was I got their LED strip that's Z-Wave compatible, and the connection between the strip and the power supply was a bit flimsy. but it's one of those things you plug it in once and never touch it again. So it's not really a huge deal. But a couple weeks ago, the doorbell that I got from them, the outside button popped off. So doorbell still works, but it just doesn't look as good. So I contacted support because I was like, hey, these doorbells aren't cheap. It's only been a year and a half that I've had it. I've been seeing a lot of people's doorbells have been breaking recently because COVID. People are using like hard implements to hit doorbells instead of just ringing them, which I can't really blame them. And they were like, oh, normally we just send you out a new part or replacement, but they've discontinued that version, so they can't. And so I was like, so, what can we do? Because, I just got this a couple of years ago. And they said, okay, we'll just send you the newest version, a replacement. And I mean, I haven't gotten it yet, but I have to say, I can't recommend Aeon Labs enough. I mean, their customer service was really on top of it.
That's great. It's funny. Yesterday, I went outside and there was a big box sitting out on my deck. I was like, I don't remember anything coming in today.
Was it ticking?
Was it ticking?
Oh, that's good.
I pick up the box. It's addressed to me and it's from Peloton. As you know, I've mentioned in the past that I bought into the Peloton ecosystem. Just did my 50th ride yesterday, the day before. And it's a box to me from Peloton. I'm like, I didn't order anything. It was a pretty good sized box. I opened it up and it was a thank you card. And inside of it was a nice hat and a water bottle. And it was just thanking us for being customers.
Oh,
That's
nice.
pretty cool. Yeah. It's pretty nice.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
I get the hat right here. It's a really nice hat. So I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, it's nice when companies recognize the customers.
I was going to make a joke. I thought Erica had gotten you a helmet for your Peloton.
When you fall off that thing, you're going to kill yourself because your feet are clipped into the pedals. If you fall off that thing, I got bigger problems than a helmet.
You're listening to the show right now. You should pause and look at videos of people falling off their Peloton on YouTube. I'm sure they're out there.
Anyway, I think we can move on to the main topic. So this week we're talking about multilingual translating your website. One of our listeners, John, reached out and asked us to talk about translation at some point. We've touched on it in the past a bit, but we've never really talked about the preparation that goes into setting up a multilingual site. So I have a couple of sites, a couple of projects that are multi-language. There are always challenges that are unique to the project. And there's a lot to discuss. So I'm excited to talk about this. And, Drupal 8 obviously makes translation significantly easier. But there's some newer developments in Drupal 8 that have some translation, side effects. So I'm interested to hear what you guys have to say.
I'm curious if you guys did a Drupal 7 translation project.
Yes.
Okay, so I did too. Absolutely. All right. So we're all coming from the perspective of we've done Drupal 7 and the technology challenges there were horrendous. And now we're in Drupal 8 where the technology challenges have minimized a lot. So it's interesting to look at it from a historical perspective.
So looking at it. What's that? Are you doing translation on that?
Yep. One
cool.
Drupal 9 site.
So, it's interesting, Stephen. I thought about that while I was looking at the show notes, and I think we're all going to probably the tips and tricks in this show predominantly refer to Drupal 8, I would say, but could very much be used in a Drupal 7 site. I think the one thing to note in Drupal 7 is there are two different ways of doing translation in Drupal 7. So one of those ways got carried through to Drupal 8. The other one faded into the sunset, rightfully so.
I feel like that's one of the biggest improvements, to be honest. Like, it didn't really matter which one was I think they chose the right one, but
absolutely.
It's almost like it didn't really matter which direction was chosen, whether it was entity-based or field-based, because...
Well, with our show being preparing for a multi-language site, you should not be preparing for one in Drupal 7.
No.
All right,
Absolutely not.
that's like
No.
off the table here.
Yeah.
Okay.
I
No,
agree.
you should definitely not be.
Okay.
But anyway, so just be aware if you're working in Drupal 7, there's a little bit of a landscape shift there. But when you're preparing for multilingual, the one of the most important things, I don't know if it is the most important, because I think translations themselves are probably pretty important, but figuring out what languages you're going to be translating into, right? So this is a lot of this is basically the first question we always ask when somebody says, oh, I need to do translation. Okay, well, what languages and how many of them? I think a lot of the reason that this question comes up is for a couple of different reasons, right? Depending on what languages you choose, there are different levels of complexity with those languages. They're different. Certain languages are right to left, other languages are left to right. So you have to factor that into your thinking and your plan for translation.
Yep.
But then you also have to think about your source language. How are your what is your source language going to be on your site most of the time? Well, let me ask this. This is actually a question for all of you. I would say, typically the sites that we done have always been English as a source translation, source language. Have any of you done a site where English was not the source language?
Yeah. So source language doesn't actually have to be one language. A source language is just what language was an individual page created in. And so, many times, especially for people working in America, you're writing the content in English and then translating it somewhere else. So English would be your source language. But, if you have an overseas department, they might be writing their content in Spanish and then translating it to English. And then the English side is, the American side is writing in English and translating it to Spanish. Or I have I have a client who has 9 languages that are regularly translated on the site. Most content is there, but they have some information that's in, there's, I think, 5 or 6 other languages. And so those 5 or 6 other languages, they're their own source. Whatever that content is, that's created specifically just for that market, and it's not translated anywhere else. So the source is just about an individual page or entity. And it's important to know if it's going to be mostly one way, if it's going to be symmetrical or asymmetrical on the source language side, because
is it though? And I ask that because when you get into Drupal configuration, the source language is set there, right? It's not set per node, right?
Sure it is. When you create a node,
yeah.
So you can set a default source language.
Is set to, yeah.
Yeah, but you can change that. When you go to create a node, you can set you can set it to be Spanish. And then if you create a Spanish page, when you go to the translation, you're going to see that there's no English translation created.
That's super interesting. I've clearly never tried to change the source of a page other than to what the default site.
You must not work with content editors that have a site that isn't automatically translated then, because the number of times I get support calls saying, hey, I created the Spanish page and there's no English anymore. It's because they create a new page and change it to Spanish.
Interesting.
So yeah, it takes a little bit deeper understanding on the content editor side when you have that. That's one of the considerations. You have to make sure that there's training to cover that. Just briefly before we move on to, I wanted to mention too, there's a couple of other considerations too when you're knowing what types of languages, because John mentioned there's left to right, there's right to left, and that's true, but there's also other considerations. So for example, if you start in English and go to German is 30 to 40% longer on average.
That's always a headache for your design team when it's like,
especially menus.
This site's going to be in English, Spanish, and German. And once you hear German, you're like, okay, well, everything's going to have to be either smaller or like more space for longer words.
And then the opposite direction is for something like Japanese. You're condensing your content significantly when you translate into Japanese. So So it's definitely important to know what those languages are and do some research on if there's any challenges going between any of the languages.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the last part to languages is, figuring out how you're going to detect languages, right? So in Drupal, by default, you have a couple of different methods for language detection. You can just set it, or it could be set by the browser. It can be set by a path. It could be set by a cookie. Help me out. Which other ones am I forgetting?
Domain, user, and language switcher.
Domain, user, and the language switcher. Of course, the language switcher is obviously the most brute force way of doing it, right? Like, hey, user, what language would you like to see?
Yeah, I think one of the really nice things about this is that Drupal allows you to weight it. So you can say, hey, by default, use their browser language. So if somebody's using a German version of Firefox, they'll get the German version of the site. And then maybe you could do path next. A lot of my clients will do browser, then path, and then user, like the switcher.
So I have
go ahead.
Sorry, I cut you off. You just jumping in on the path thing. I have a lot of experience with the path. I'm wondering what you guys have as far as a preferred. Do you have a preferred language detection method?
I mean, it really depends on the use case, but generally I find most people land on, I think the cleanest is generally path/switcher, because the path makes it so that you can easily share. And somebody, like if you're sharing a link with somebody, they're going to get the language you're sharing. But then that person can change the language easily if they want to. Domain, I find domains to be the most complicated. Like domains cause a lot of
issues. It depends, right? And in my experience, it depends on if you're working with multilingual, multi-regional sites, because in that case, typically you'd want your region tied to a domain and then your language tied to a path. But there are some sites and some companies out there that tie their region and their language to a path. So you have to be aware of that when you're setting out on your translation journey, right? Because you want to take that into account when you're trying to figure out, okay, well, if my path structure, for example, if I have a French regional site in French, there's a chance that my path could be, /fr/fr-fr, which is just, it kind of makes things a little bit more complicated. So,
yeah, I mean, you have to be careful though, because certain regions, China in particular, like if you have a .cn domain, they don't allow you to have an SSL certificate that they haven't provided. So if you have a .cn domain, you're forced to have a compromised SSL certificate. So if you want to have a localized domain that's translated in China, then you're compromising anybody that even with other languages, because if they happen to go to CN, log in, and then go to
site, you could do, instead of doing TLD, you could do do subdomains, right? So, it's just something to think about. It depends on what your use case is. I would say probably 75% of the sites out there are going to be fine just using path for language detection, because they're not,
that's the most common, I think.
Overly worried. Have you guys ever done like cookie detection?
Well,
I've done IP detection where I check where the user is coming from and use that as the default. But not cookie per se. What cookie?
I was just curious, if you were, somehow setting a cookie for language and using that to kind of set the user's language. But talk about your IP detection. Did you run into any issues doing that?
Interesting you ask that, because it was the first translated site I did, and it was probably 15 years ago. So I don't recall.
So it wasn't Drupal.
No, it wasn't in Drupal. No, it was in Cold Fusion.
Oh God.
So I imagine
That's been pleasant.
I imagine it would have scarred you in a way that you would remember and be able to tell us about.
I don't know. Well, I don't know, John. You're giving me way more credit than I deserve on my memory, but
I mean,
it's like logically, I think it works. It's and we're talking about defaults. I don't remember any super challenges.
I mean, doesn't the language switcher use a cookie? I mean, I've honestly never looked into it deeply, but I got to imagine the language switcher set some kind of cookie to set the preference.
Well, so I think the default language switcher, based on your detection settings, if you're using a path, most of the time it just basically links you to the path that has the language.
I suppose.
We're going down a detection rabbit hole here. Yeah. The only reason I ask about the IP is because I've run into issues with IP and caching and things like that. So I was interested to see what your road looked like.
I just prefer language roulette. Every page load it chooses.
Right. There's one more thing I wanted to bring up before we move on to our next section is making a decision about, when you're thinking about translation, is how much of the site are you translating? Mm-hmm. Are you translating 100%? Because that's one thing. Or are you translating a percentage? And there's some decisions around that. Like, it costs money, whether it's internal or external, to translate 100% of a website. And certainly when you start to think about, if you've got news, press releases that go back, how far do you translate? Yep. And the reason I bring this up, part of the reason I bring this up is, like, if you're only partially translating a site, making then the decision of, if I'm a Spanish speaker and I come to a site and I switch to Spanish, do I still see the English, even though I've said I'm Spanish? It gets, there's a lot of decisions that aren't technical ones. They could end up, you have to find technical ways to implement them, but they're beyond technical issues on deciding how a non-English speaker sees your content.
And they become
not in their language.
It becomes really a more of a usability issue, right? If somebody comes to a page and most of the content is in Spanish, but that key block that they need is in English, it makes it more difficult. Something to think about there too, when you're planning for this, is that you don't necessarily have to do all of the languages at once, right? So if you said, hey, we need to do 10 languages, you could start off with doing 2 or 3 languages, get the site into those 2 or 3 languages, and then add languages as after the fact. Because as you're going to see through this process, you're going to you may have to find some things, especially if you're doing a whole site translation, that you have to translate. So.
And I think sometimes too, it's easy for somebody to come in and say, yeah, we want 100% of the site translated, but achieving that is actually very difficult. There's a few things. For example, most people say they want 100% of the site translated. So you say, okay, we're translating the administrative interface too, right? And they say, oh no, not that. So right there, that's not 100%. But there's strings that get embedded in places that are sometimes very difficult to find. For example, one of the more difficult things to translate sometimes, depending on how you're managing them, is days of the week. So if you're outputting things in Twig directly, manipulating date formats, which
is always fun anyway.
Yeah.
Never mind the language.
Exactly. Doing a translation on that day of the week abbreviation is very difficult. Now, I mean, to be fair, Drupal's date format system, you can translate the date format, so it's actually pretty straightforward if you can go through there. But there are situations that you're using Twig directly to manipulate a date, and that becomes very, very difficult to translate properly.
So let's move into let's talk a little bit about the translation itself. First question is always, like, who is going to translate? Like, is it internal? Is it external? And once someone does translate, who's going to validate it? Drupal 8 is really nice in that out of the box, you have all the tools there to do all the translation and manage them if you want to. You don't need a third party. You can handle everything yourself. You could even give a third party access to Drupal to put translations in. But it's really important to figure out who's going to do it and how much it's going to cost.
And one point there too is that a lot of core is translated into a bunch of different languages already. So you do have some of that translation done for you as far as the admin goes. If you were going to do that translation,
we actually have a show that we did. I'm just going to bring it up here. 232 translation tips. We had 2 guests on that day, and they talked about translation, and it was really a lot of information around structuring the project from a management perspective, how to select a translation partner like a Lingotech or another company, and some tips around that process, the team you should have in place. Today, we're not touching on those things as much, but it's a recent episode too. I think it was this year. I think it
January.
Was it January? Okay. It's the beginning of this year. So it's not very old and it's relevant. So it's a good place to get some of those other tips on certainly on selecting a vendor and managing translations internally. I remember we had an interesting discussion in that about, setting up your own translation Bible per se inside your organization so you can manage the terms and help make sure your translations are consistent and stuff. So a lot of good information in that episode. So you guys have any, go ahead.
I was going to say, one of the things to consider too, this kind of goes a little bit back to some of the stuff we were talking about before too, is when you're selecting the vendor, it's important to understand things like, are the translations going to be symmetrical or are they going to be asymmetrical? So
to describe it, you've used that term a couple of times. Why don't you describe what that is?
Yeah. So my understanding of it is a symmetrical translation is everything that goes, let's say we're going from English to Spanish, everything that goes into the English side gets translated into Spanish. Asymmetrical means that you might actually say, hey, translating this doesn't actually work. We need to essentially write a Spanish page for this. So it is, for an About Us page, it might make sense to just do a straight translation. You translate, the name, the company, the mission, and into Spanish, and it works fine. But for some content, the Spanish community might say this particular type of information is more important than this other information, whereas the English community thinks the other information is more important. So they might not, it might be a translation in spirit of the page, but ordered in a way that the community reading it, it displays the important information first. So that'd be an asymmetrical translation.
Have you seen a whole site that does a symmetrical translation that it's just one-to-one?
Oh yeah.
Really?
Absolutely. Most people that do translations, I think, out of the box are just doing symmetrical because it's easy. Because what they're doing is they're trying to make the content available in the other language. They're not really
not caring too much.
Yeah.
Okay.
I've seen it where you're doing symmetrical as far as the content is one-to-one, but some of the products or some of the pages aren't there because they don't necessarily apply. Typically, Nick, would you say like asymmetrical is more used in a localization context where like, hey, we have like US specific information on this page. Okay, we're going to translate it, but we're going to change it to be more, South America specific or Europe specific, depending on
I think that's one way. I mean, I think the other big place is media. I think almost always. So for example, if you have a YouTube video on the English side, it's a pseudo asymmetrical translation. You might have a Spanish video that you put in there. So there's a video in the same place on both. Yeah. Or if you have, if you have an image that has an overlay or something, you might have a different image. Or maybe it's even, or for example, like you look at like, what's that movie, Inside Out from Pixar, in America, the food that the kids were eating that was super disgusting was broccoli. and they swapped, I forget what it was actually. I think they swapped it to green beans or something. But in Japan, kids love broccoli. So they didn't make the disgusting food broccoli. They swapped it out. So it's like, I think it's mostly localization, but with media, sometimes it's easier just to get it translated by asymmetrical. So it's symmetrical in that it's a similar content, but it's asymmetrical because it's not quote unquote translated.
So going back, kind of to the original topic of translation, right? Stephen talked about kind of doing it, being able to do it yourself, or selecting a vendor. We don't have to get into like how you go about selecting a vendor, but I wanted to touch on that a little bit as far as, a vendor for what, and what kind of, kind of services are these vendors going to provide for you as far as translation goes?
To be honest, I only ever see two types of vendors in the translation game. One is they're doing the actual translation. So you're giving them the content, they're giving you the translated content back.
Right.
The other type is they're validating translations. So usually they also could be doing the translation, but sometimes it's just a second pass to valid. Because one thing that I've learned, no matter which vendor you use, no matter how reputable they are, no matter how good they are, you have another translator or another native speaker looking at that content, they're going to have disagreements on how exactly something was translated. Or for some more obscure languages, you just need to confirm that they're actually, you're getting what you're paying for, right? Those are the only two kind of vendors.
I think there's a third one there though, is that there's vendors that provide technology, like Lingotech provides a translation management system. Right. You don't have to use their translators. You can, but you don't have to. But they're providing a tool that is outside of Drupal for translators to use to help translate your content. So that's a good point. There are vendors that provide the technology, and you don't. I think that's one of the points that was made in that episode 232, is that you don't necessarily have to tie your translators to your technology vendor. And it's a good point. And I think people get stuck in that mindset when they don't need to. You could use the Lingotech TMS translation management system and use it with your own translators if you wanted to, because it definitely is a powerful interface that is quite different than what you'd get just by using what you get inside of Drupal.
Yeah, you also get some benefits that aren't inherently found in Drupal too, right? As far as like a translation, like a vault for your translated terms and things like that.
Yeah.
Drupal. So I actually added to our show notes here contractors. Wondering if either of you have ever used a contractor for language or translation. And the reason that I bring this up in specific with Stephen's reference to Lingotech is a lot of people that translate for a living are very used to certain types of translation management systems or translation tools. Right. So having them go into Drupal could be an additional cost for you, because it's going to take them more time because they're not familiar with it. So something to think about when you're planning on your translation is, hey, if I'm using a vendor or a contractor, finding out if they have integrations into your CMS, or if they have an issue using it.
Yeah, I mean, I've only ever used contractors for verification. So, I mean, they used the tool that we were using. So I wasn't part of that piece of the conversation, but that's it. That's a good point.
So, I think that's an interesting point too. And you touched on it a little bit, is, verifying the languages. Companies that I've worked with in the past have had kind of in country folks that can review the translations and verify that they're correct as far as terminology and goes within the country. That's super important to do, to make sure you have that step in your process when doing your translations. It's one thing for somebody to translate text from one language to another, but you want to make sure that it's contextually correct within the country.
And it also needs to be domain. Really, you need to have a domain expert. So just someone who's in market and can translate text doesn't mean they know your business. So for example, like the website that I did in 7 for the ATF, which is around firearms and explosives and stuff, having someone translate in market, they might have the words right translated, but they might not be using them contextually correct in terms of understanding explosives and guns. So like for that website, it was really important to pull together a team of people inside the ATF that know Spanish that could help find those issues when the in-market person doesn't know the firearms business. So it's something to keep in mind.
Yeah. I think another thing to think about when you're doing translations, and this can be one of those things where you don't think about this until the end and it kind of creeps up on you, is how you handle URL aliases. Now, I've typically tried to stay away from translating URL aliases in the past, wondering what your experiences have been. Stephen, have you translated URL aliases?
I'm sorry. Let me just make a note here. I'm busy looking at the Slack here. We're at an hour already. We haven't recorded for an hour, but I see you guys are back and forth. Should we keep going or not?
I mean, I got time, so.
Yeah, I have some time. It's just, I guess the reason why I brought it up is we've had a lot of longer shows, and I just didn't know if we're only halfway. So if we've got another.
I actually think we're much further than halfway in terms of this document, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I think the rest of these are probably pretty quick.
Okay.
Because we've already talked about the symmetrical stuff.
16 minutes before. What are we talking about?
We're talking about URL aliases right now.
URL aliases.
Okay.
Okay. Ready?
Yes.
So I typically don't translate URL aliases. I find that it's cleaner. Usually if you're using path-based, I find it's cleaner if it's just whatever the source language URL is, and you just have the /es/en/fr, and then whatever it is. Now, interestingly, I think you need to, if you're using a tool, I think you need to actually mark it as translatable and then just not translate it. And then it will just like autofill. So, if in the case of Lingotech, if you're using Lingotech, you would mark the alias as translatable in Drupal, but not mark it as translatable in Lingotech. And then, Drupal will just kind of handle autofilling that. But yeah, I typically don't translate. I did have one site that had translatable aliases, and I just remember it became a mess fairly quickly. And very confusing for both the users and the content editors. And so I think we actually backed it out.
I guess one thing I wonder with that is from a content perspective, I don't know the answer to this either, like a Spanish speaker or whatever language, just use that as an example. Are they used to seeing URLs in Spanish, or are they used to seeing them in English?
I mean, that
or are they paying attention to them at all?
No,
Right.
I think it depends.
Because it is, a URL is part of the content in a way.
Yes.
To some degree, right?
So it's interesting. Good.
I think the main dependency is where the source of the website is. So for example, websites in Colombia, the URLs are in Spanish. Websites in Spain,
that's right.
the URLs are in Spanish.
Right.
A lot of US based companies, people that speak Spanish that are in the US, they're expecting and used to the URLs, I think, being in English.
So maybe if it's a .com, they're probably thinking they're in English.
And to be honest, I think there's something to be said for localizing the URL, but I think it's also one of those things where people are so used to even well-translated sites having English URLs that having non-English URL, they're not going to get benefit from that because they're not looking for it because they're just used to it being English anyway.
Does it turn out to be an alias for the page? Is that what ends up happening like on the Drupal side?
That I have done. So I've set up special Spanish. So I have a client that just had a major campaign on the radio in Spanish, and they needed a really easy URL for Spanish.
Yeah.
And so we set up a redirect
Right.
so it'd be like, slash, they didn't want slash ES slash English or Spanish. They just wanted, slash whatever the campaign was. And it was a Spanish
in Spanish,
word.
right? Makes sense.
And we just redirected that to the Spanish version of.
So it ended up going to a /ES page.
English page. Yeah,
okay.
Correct.
So, I mean, it's interesting that we're talking about this in planning for your multilingual site, right? Because if you were to translate your URL aliases, there'd be quite a bit of planning that had to go in there. Some areas where I've kind of found this to be a little bit difficult is block content, for example, right? If you have a link to something in your block content, that link is in English, but then you would have to translate that block into Spanish, being sure to change that link in the content to the Spanish URL alias for consistency throughout. So it does take some planning and some thought as far as where you're placing your content. Menu system, the menu system should update automatically. I say that with a little bit of hesitation because it depends on how you set up your menu. But yeah, I think you have to definitely plan for translating URL aliases quite a bit.
To your point too is, if you're just doing path-based in both of the tail end as English, you can do things. So for example, in Lingotech, you can say, if I have a URL that's in content and I want it to be translated because it's an internal link for whatever reason, there's ways to essentially flag that URL. Normally, so if it's an external link, you don't want to translate it because you want it to go to the external link no matter what.
Yep.
It's an internal link, you can flag it. And so you can that will tell the person translating, hey, if this is /about and this you're translating into Spanish, and now it has to be /ES/about. But if you're translating the URL, the alias, then they need to know, okay, what does /about translate into?
Right.
One person might translate about one way and another person might translate it a different way. So John, that's a great point. That really complicates things if you're doing in-content translation.
And hence the reason I've steered clear of URL alias translation, because I'm like, okay,
that's what the problem ended up being.
This is like a minefield right here. Minefield.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a huge consideration that you wouldn't think at first.
This brings us to the next point here, which is something that I love to do for things like this.
Prototyping?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I think that's key. I mean, the number one thing you need to do, especially if you've never done translation before, you need to prototype all the major cases that you're gonna be hitting. I mean, translation is complex. I mean, forget the actual nitty-gritty of actually translating content. Translation on a website, language negotiation, content translation, it's complex. So it's very, very, very important. Even if you're experienced in translation, it's important to prototype all the different systems that you'll be interacting with. That's important for a few reasons. One, things change. Two, you need to make sure that the content editors kind of have a look at what's going on. You need to make sure there's buy-in on the process, that it will work for them. You need to make sure how things are going to work. Things like, file embeds, URLs, media, images, because there's a difference between having an image on a page that's translated and having a media entity on the page that's translated. If you have paragraphs.
I was just gonna say, yeah, if you're doing things like using paragraphs, display suite, conditional fields, all those kinds of things, whatever those things are, get them into the prototype and make sure they translate, and then they show up the way you expect them to. Have one of every kind of page layout that you're going to use. You're using Layout Builder. Make sure you get all those into the prototype.
Layout Builder is a huge one. Because Layout Builder usually use blocks, but you can use paragraphs in Layout Builder. You can use custom entities in Layout Builder. You can use config entities in Layout Builder, and each of those have their own challenges. The other thing I would say you want to prototype is the theming system. One of the issues that I ran into early on, one of my first Drupal 8 projects was I had some nested paragraphs that were translated, and I needed to pull some data out of one of the nested paragraphs. And so I went into the render array before I knew how to do that properly in Twig, and pulled the content out, and suddenly information wouldn't translate. Like the whole web page would be Spanish, and then that one field that I pulled out would be in English.
It is
so yeah, you definitely need to prototype.
It's something, I think Nick talked about images and media, right? And switching between, an English version, a Spanish version, so on and so forth. Drupal does help a great deal with that sort of stuff, but through prototyping, you'll be able to identify, what images, what videos, what things need to be switched out between an English version and a Spanish version. Drupal does allow you to do that. You just need to kind of kick the tires on it and know what is and isn't possible. I will also say, if you're doing code review on your themes, make sure that your front-end development team is using the T function when they're coding their themes to make sure that strings within a theme are being translated or able to be translated. One of the biggest things when we go into start translation on a site is like, hey, this phrase, this button, this thing needs to be translated, and we can't find it anywhere. It's not in Drupal's. Oh, hey, it's a string in the theme, and it's not wrapped in a T function. Okay, well, we're going to go in and add that, and that should rectify the situation. So, definitely through your prototyping, make sure that you're getting familiar with those theme functions that you need to use in order to make sure your content is translatable.
The other big gotcha that's helpful, the two big gotchas that are helpful to prototype are filters on views. Like there's a bunch of different ways to filter language specific stuff, and most of them aren't going to quite interact the way you expect them to. So you want to test a bunch of different situations there. Usually you want to grab the interface language, but there's other times that you want other things. And the other thing to really be careful of, maybe this was more for the last kind of section of the show, but things that kind of bridge the gap between content and configuration, things like web forms, blocks, things like custom blocks, like those can be somewhat complex. Views, those can be somewhat complex to keep translated and updated. So you definitely want to prototype, how that process is going to look.
Yeah, that prototyping process helps you get more comfortable with understanding what Drupal thinks of things. Like, what does it think of as config? What is strings? Because sometimes it's surprising to you. And then when you can't find something, you see it in English and it should be in Spanish, digging through those and tracking down where this thing is coming from, like John mentioned, and why Drupal is categorizing it the way it is interesting. And it gives you an opportunity to test things like Nick mentioned with a view, like just functionality. Like if I'm on a Spanish page and I've got a view of content and it's in Spanish, should I see English content there if a piece of the content was not translated to Spanish? That's a functional decision. You could go either way technically, but should Spanish speakers see a view that has like one row of data showing up in English, or should you hide it if there's no Spanish translation?
That
Those
also
are the kinds of things you'll see when you prototype.
Yeah, that brings up a great point to also, when you're prototyping, take a path of the user, right? When a user comes to your site and they want to see something in a different language, how are they going to switch the language? When they switch the language, as Steven said, do all the views show up in the right language? Is the path structure the way that you anticipate it to be? I think you can through your prototype, you can definitely do a little bit of UX or user experience testing there as well to make sure things are going to work how you anticipate them working. I think after we've talked about prototyping, and that's always a good thing. But I think we've all come across challenges. Nick talked a little bit about layout builder and paragraphs. I'm interested to hear more about challenges that you guys have come across, and maybe we can help listeners to avoid them.
I mean, some of them are technical challenges. You mentioned layout builder. I mean, layout builder really throws a wrench in the works when it comes to translation. Translation is possible with layout builder. It's significantly more complex and less flexible than general in my experience. But it's definitely something you're gonna have to test significantly. In fact, I have some clients that do a lot of translation, and they're basically just doing manual translation of layout builder pages because it's just easier to build it and then build it again in the second language than it is to, translate the individual pieces. There's also project challenges. I mean, the two biggest that I generally see on projects are, one, budget. Translation is not cheap, either for development time or actual translation. So you need to make sure that you have the budget set for that. And then the other thing is time, and I don't mean just time for the project. I mean, individual translations. If you have a really important page going up and it needs to be translated and it's 3,000 words, you're going to need to coordinate that ahead of time and make sure that the translation company has it or the translator has it, a few days in advance, because it takes time, physical time to translate a page.
It's something that I think everybody underestimates. Nobody realizes that we create content. The content then has to be translated, so it goes off to the translator. Then it has to be verified, so somebody in country is verifying it, and then it's back into the CMS to be displayed. But then what happens when somebody edits that content? Now we got to go through that whole process again. It takes time. So that's another great tip, right? To say like, hey, try to get your content to be in its final place before you start translating it. Which, it's never going to be 100% perfect. There are always going to be changes happening, and translation's always a thing that keeps on happening again and again. But try your hardest to get that content into a good enough state, so that way you can do your first translation pass.
Yeah, I just echo everything you guys just said. The minute someone hits a save button, that means there's more work to be done anytime someone changes content. And I'm interested in your guys' thought on this. So you've got a page up. It's been translated into Spanish. Looks great. Someone goes and adds 2 paragraphs in English, and it's going to take 3 weeks for that turnaround, or a week for that turnaround. Does the English page go up and the Spanish page is the old translation, or do you wait for everything to be translated so they're equal?
Well, it usually depends. So most of my clients, the way they do, if it's a new page, then the Spanish side gets the English side until it's translated. If it's an existing page, the Spanish side has the old translation, unless it's a critical thing. So for example, if somebody gets fired, before they're fired, they vandalize a page and put up a bunch of nonsense, and it got translated to Spanish somehow before it noticed. You can edit that page. That would get edited and taken down right away. But in general, unless it's a very time sensitive thing, in general, the Spanish page will just be the last best translation.
And it's just it's an interesting thing to bring up, because there's lots of approaches to this, and often, unless you're experienced with this, it's often something that you don't realize until after the site's live, that these things start to creep up as, hey, wait a minute.
And very rare. Go ahead.
Yeah, I finished it. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, and very rarely do you see people doing the hybrid approach, right? Where it's like a mix between Spanish and English, where like you see kind of like the half translated, half untranslated content. That just feels very broken to people when they come to the site. we talked about content versus user interface. I don't know that we need to talk more about that, but I think, it's worth highlighting again that that is a challenge to understand where that divide is and what items on your site are in the content versus the user interface. I will say,
and it's not completely working either.
Well,
or very
in
clear
Drupal.
sometimes.
No, it's definitely not very clear, but I will say that Drupal core does a pretty good job of helping you understand where those things are for the most part. I've seen some oddities, especially around commerce, where certain items in commerce aren't exactly where you thought they should be. But as you, again, go through that prototyping step and you'll understand like, oh, this button, the word on this button isn't actually part of the content. It's part of some user interface somewhere within the
I'd say one of the biggest pain points, I think, in my book is some things like they're clearly configuration, but when it comes to translation, they shouldn't be. And I understand why they are, but the two biggest ones in my book are web form and views. I don't know the number of times that I've found for some projects, the easiest way is to, when you update a view, you translate it, it gets translated. You then have to get a dump of the website so that you can export the config in that state and commit the configuration translation. Otherwise, the next time you push up, it's going to overwrite it, and you're going to lose that translation.
So there are, and we don't need to turn this into the config management show, but I will say that be aware if you are using the config sync features of Drupal 8, that you're definitely going to see an increase in your configuration set when you start doing translation. Config files tend to multiply when things start to get translated.
So is there anything that people should avoid that we haven't already mentioned that you can think of? We've got some things on our list here. What haven't we mentioned?
I would say Google Translate. So a lot of people, are like, I'm going to translate my site. I'm just going to use Google Translate. That's fine if you,
or any machine translation.
Or any, sorry, I don't mean to harp on Google. I just, that's usually the first one people go for. Right. But it's great if you're using it to try to figure out one word or two words. Typically it does not do a great job on, large portions of text. And that context we were talking about before usually gets lost with machine translation.
And it's not even just using machine translation directly. I mean, I've had clients put the Google translation widget on their site that lets you select a language from the dropdown and it
goes back to that usability thing, right? Sometimes the usability can be pretty clunky. I will say that if you use a vendor, some services offer a first pass of machine translation, which is a cost saving measure. That's not what I'm talking about here, because that ultimately then gets reviewed by an actual translator and reviewed by somebody in country or a subject matter expert. What I'm suggesting here is just relying on Google Translate or a machine translation service to translate your website. That's not gonna be the best thing for your end user.
Any other things to avoid?
I mean, not too much. I mean, I would just say the only other advice here is just to try to stay as close to core as possible.
Right.
The core has very, very good support, with maybe layout being a big exception. Core in general has very good support of translation. So the closer you are to that, the better off you'll be. So there are a couple of useful modules if you are looking at translation. So there is, if you do want Layout Builder to support translation, you're most likely going to need to use either the symmetric or asymmetric translation module. They are incompatible with each other. So you need to determine your strategy going in, whether or not you'll have symmetrical or asymmetrical translations, period. And I think support is growing for layout builder and translation.
It is.
I know that Lingotech recently put out an update that supposedly, I haven't finished testing, but supposedly solves a lot of the issues with layout builder and integration with their platform. But if you are using layout builder, you're most likely going to need one of those two modules. So I would take a look at them.
I'm sorry, I'm thinking about those modules and the two different versions of translation, and I'm like, asymmetric seems like the way to go for me in every scenario. I mean, I guess if you had a pretty basic site and you wanted to just, you were just doing a straight translation, you would go, semantic. But, I think individuals have to choose for themselves. I'm just trying to figure it out in my head.
Just so it's clear, asymmetric in the context of layout builder means you're basically just creating the page again yourself.
Right.
Like you're not I think you get the sections, but I think you have to add every block manually.
Right. The other module
per language.
Per language.
Right. And that's always the X factor, right? You have to think about is like how much again time do I have to duplicate this per language. The other module is a pretty simple. It's a language switcher dropdown. By default, Drupal, I think you still uses a list for the language selection. This just allows you to use a dropdown, and it gives you like little stylistic elements to the dropdown. I think on the module page you see it has flags for each country. So just another way to use a language switcher if you need to.
Hey, if you have any questions or feedback, you can always reach out to us on Twitter at Talking Drupal. You could hit us up on the Drupal Slack at Talking Drupal, or you could email us. You got 3 ways to do it. show@talkingdrupal.com is the email there. You can also get updates by signing up for our newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter. We do have another show coming up that we're recording in a few weeks. That was another request from a listener. So if you have things you want us to talk about, let us know.
Yeah, drop them into one of those methods of communication. We'd also like to thank our patrons for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support's greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing the big button that says Become a Patron.
Smash that button.
Crush that big. Never mind.
And if our listeners wanted to get a hold of you, Stephen, how would they get in touch with you?
Visit www.stephencross.com.
And John, how can the listeners get in touch with you?
www. They can find me on all the major social networks at John Picozzi, as well as Drupal.org. You can find out about Oomph at oomphinc.com.
And Nick?
And listeners can always reach me pretty much everywhere online at Nixvan, NICXVAN. And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking.